So welcome to These Three Things with my special guest, Dr. Vincent Covello. And Dr. Covello, so thrilled that you're here for the first episode of These Three Things, because These Three Things is inspired by you. Whenever we have conversations or I receive an email from you, in many cases, you'll say, "Hey, Ben, three things." And in lots of our conversations, you will say, "I'm a fan of three." And so, therefore, I'm a fan of three, especially when it relates to risk and crisis communications. And so, if you could highlight for us the three things that you love about these three things.
Well, first of all, you are correct that I do practice and preach the number three over and over again for three major reasons. Number one is it helps to gather a person's attention. One of our first challenges in risk and crisis communication is getting people's attention focused on our messages, as opposed to all the other messages coming to us from mainstream media, from social media, from friends, family, etc. That it quite literally helps us cut through, for example, all the various types of information we're hearing so that we can pay attention to the messages we would like people to hear. So that's number one, attention. Number two is recall, memory. If we can't remember something that someone has said is important to remember, such as an emergency, a crisis, or related to a threat, then what's the value of the communications if people cannot remember? And number three is understanding. If people are more likely to pay attention to the message, more likely to recall the message, that we have a higher probability of understanding the message, understanding what the person would like us to understand. So those three come into play. Number one, again, we're looking for something that will increase people's attention to our messages. Number two, something that will increase recall to our messages. And number three, increase understanding of our messages. All three are accomplished when you have a good group of threes by which to organize. And I just sent you a document. We could put it on the screen if you'd like later, of all the different threes that we use. Everything from Three Little Pigs to trinities in virtually every major religion, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In crisis, here's a little test for you, Ben. In crisis management, we have a number of these threes that we offer as a way by which to alert people of what they should do in a crisis, such as in a fire. Here's your test.
Stop, drop, roll.
This.
Run, hide, fight for an active assailant. Wash your hands with soap and water. Stay home if you're feeling sick. Cover your mouth if you cough and sneeze. If you're dealing with a pandemic, the rule of threes.
Rule three, if you wash your hands, you should wash it in three ways. Number one, you should wash your hands with hot soap and water. Number two, you should wash your hands for at least 20 to 30 seconds, as long as it takes to sing happy birthday. And number three, you should wash your hands. If you don't have time, you don't have soap and water, you can use hand sanitizer. 1, 2, 3. So things come in threes. So why would this number play such a large role in our portfolio of tools of risk communication, crisis communication? It's sometimes referred to as the rule of three, which has three parts to it. Another test. What are the three parts to the rule of three? That you have how many messages that you would repeat how many times, and for each key message, how many supporting facts would you have? I give you a lot of hints on this one.
See, now I think you're starting to hint out the tool developed by Dr. Covello called the message map. And I think that has something to do with the neuroscience and the research that's been done behind the number three, specifically as it relates to when people are feeling stressed or concerned, or in high stress, high concern environments. The average human brain can remember, recall, and process up to three pieces of information. I get home, my house is on fire, I'm feeling stressed and concerned. I only have to remember, recall, and process three pieces of information. That's a 9, a 1, and a 1.
There it is.
In other parts of the world, it's 999. If I'm having a mental health crisis, I got to call 211. If I want to speak to a health nurse or somebody, it's 811. those are all designed behind the science, the neuroscience of the brain in high stress, high concern situations and environments.
And I like the fact that you bring up the notion of high stress, high concern, because the number 3 really only plays a critical role in high stress, high concern because of a phenomena called mental noise, or sometimes cognitive static, that the stress of the situation interferes with the processing of information. And it was Aristotle over 2,000 years ago says that when people are stressed and upset, you can expect that they're going to have difficulty processing information. When people are stressed and upset, controlling for other variables, they're likely to have difficulty processing information. And one of the first major observations of research, or at least observational research, was Aristotle's notion of the rule of 3. 3 messages, repeated 3 times, each message having at least 3 supporting facts to validate the point that you're making. He first taught that to one of his greatest of all students, Alexander the Great, who, according to many historians, spoke in 3s. Because why? He was engaged in a high stress, high concern profession called war. And he was talking to war fighters and soldiers. Sometimes it's difficult to determine what actually happened and what's apocryphal, but nonetheless, apparently Alexander the Great was confronted once with a high stress question. How do you expect us, the Greek army, Macedonian army, to defeat armies much larger than themselves? And he basically had 3 messages. Message number 1, because their generals and kings will be watching the battle from a top of a hill. I, by comparison, will be amongst you. Message 1. Message number 2, I'll be more than amongst you. I will be the first to attack. And my job is not to kill the other soldier, to move them out of the way. Number 3, why do we want to move them out of the way? Because we want to get to their kings and generals so we cut off their heads. Cut off the head of the snake, you kill the snake. And what I loved about that particular is that the multiple instances I've seen that particular speech that he gave that presumably was spread around among others. The Greek army was about 5 times smaller than the Persian army. You can imagine the level of stress that might have been people would be experiencing at that time. It's the first major example we have of the use of the rule of 3. Second, then he came up with, he went beyond this. He said, beyond the rule of 3, what's the content for the rule of 3? What do we say if we have 3 messages? What do we say? And he gave us the first content. So he gave us the first structural message, the rule of 3. Speak in 3s, he sometimes would use an expression that could be translated as chunk information. Think of a person, for example, who's having difficulty digesting food and the digestive system. And if you're a good caretaker, you serve up food in spoonfuls, small amounts. Well, Aristotle made the same analogy. He said, if the brain is having difficulty processing information, for example, because of stress of the situation, then we want to make it as simple and as short as possible. And his definition of the word short was the rule of 3. Now, what I find fascinating in terms of neuroscience, that we picked up on that, which became 911, emergency numbers around the world. What I find fascinating, for example, in the rule of 3 is that the later research indicated there were more limits on messaging than the rule of 3. They applied to the 3, but they were not necessarily the same as the 3. The first was the 27 words. That we found that individuals the brain would effectively stop processing information, wander into other places in the brain after, on average, not just 3 messages, but 27 words. 27 words. Second, we found that the brain not only had a word counter, it had a stopwatch. That the brain would also start to drift into other parts of the brain after, on average, 9 seconds. And that led to an expansion of the rule of 3 to the 2793, that we work with 3 messages that we expressed in less than 27 words, less than 9 seconds, which becomes the top line of a message map. And we could show an example of a message map there. You see a message map at the very top. You see 3 key messages, ideally expressed in less than 27 words. You have 3 messages under each key message. Supporting fact that can take many forms. It can be a fact, it can be a visual, it can be a credible third party that validates the key message. Once again, everything is in 3s, everything ideally less than 27 words, less than 9 seconds. Now, here's a test question for you. Who started the modern neuroscience research? I said Aristotle gave us this over 2,000 years ago. It's been used over the centuries. Another Jeopardy question. Which Roman general liked the number three, the rule of three? Which Roman general? And I'll give you a couple of hints on this. In 61 BC, he was sent to put down a rebellion that could have led to the sacking of Rome itself. He was unheard of. He was not heard of for a substantial amount of time. Rumors were that he was killed, that the sacking would take place, and he sent back one of the shortest messages in history. 3 words. He didn't have to use 27 words. He used 3 words. And those words were, Ben.
We got him.
We got him. Say that in Latin. Say that in Latin. It's Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Veni, Vici. There's a Latin phrase, omne trium perfectum. Now let me test your Latin. If I remember my Latin correctly, that would be omne trium perfectum. What does that mean? Because Julius Caesar spoke in Greek, in Latin. So if he said to you, "Oh, Ben, omne trium perfectum," what would he be saying to you?
Can you get me 3 beers, please?
Good. Close, but no prize. It means everything that comes in threes is perfection. Everything.
Oh, I like that.
Threes is perfection. Fascinating. The field, there's hundreds of examples of threes. We could put up a slide if you'd like, which has all the different types of threes, everything from trinities in religion, three bears, liberty, justice, all of the. And here's an interesting one. I just ran across this the other day. Someone had said, Winston Churchill had said, blood, sweat, and tears. And I was tempted to correct it, but I decided to let it ride because it's actually blood, sweat, toil, and tears. There's 4. 4. What do we remember, though? People tend to remember blood, sweat, and tears. They tend to forget the 4th element. The 4th element does play a role. For example, here's another test question. 1n = 3p, which contributed to the winning of a Nobel Prize by a professor at Princeton University called Daniel Kahneman, who came up with a formula, or at least a rough form of the formula, that 1n equals, Ben?
3 positives.
Positives. 1 negative equals 3 positives. Right. So we have another classic, very important example of the use of the rule of 3, because if you have a negative or bad news to share, you need 3 to offset the negative to create a phenomenon called homeostasis, a resting state of the brain, able to now pay attention and to process additional information. Now, the modern research, I'll go back to the other question. When did the modern research on the rule of 3 begin? And I'll give you a hint. Princeton University also. However, it was not related to a high-stress issue. It had to do with a low-stress issue called a telephone number. A telephone number. Any hints going on?
That wasn't Miller, was it?
Yes, it was. There it is. You got it. Professor George Miller, 1956. He wrote a classic article in one of the leading psychological journals of the time. He had been asked by Bell Laboratories, how much can the brain hold? In the same way we can talk about a cup, for example, and you can hold 8 ounces of coffee, or we could talk about any container, how much you can hold. Bell Laboratories want to know how much can the brain hold in terms of information in its short-term memory. And the purpose of this was to create the new modern telephone number, to transfer from a named telephone number to pure digits. So Ben, I'm going to do a little test with you right now. I'm going to see how many numbers you can repeat back accurately to me. Is that all right with you?
Okay, let's try it.
487, please.
487.
Excellent. 982164.
982164.
Good. And that's called chunky, by the way. Sometimes we chunk in 3s and 4s. 531824862.
531824862.
Are you sure of that?
No.
No. Okay. Right. Three things, according to Professor Miller's research, will happen when you exceed the capacity of the brain to process information. Number one, the person gets it wrong. Number two, even if they get it right, they will be stressed because of the uncertainty. Uncertainty often equals stress. And number three, they start to dislike the communicator because you're stressing the brain. You're putting too much information in the brain to be processed, especially if it's an important thing such as remembering your own telephone number. So, Professor Miller, magic number 7, plus or minus 2, limits of the brain in low stress situations. Now we have to shift to high stress, as opposed to low stress of simple things like, what's your telephone number? I'll give you a call after the conference. Now we have high stress. Somebody's having a heart attack. We smell some smoke, for example. There's a concern, for example, that somebody might be, a terrorist in the event, whatever it might be. How many numbers are we allowed in our telephone number now? And just go over that list you had before. Almost virtually. In fact, I don't think I know a country where it wasn't 3, but it's possible there's one out there. And you had gone through a long list of where the emergency telephone number, the number 3.
Yeah, and when I used to be still in the paramedic business and doing first aid training and that sort of thing, when working or doing a first aid course at a corporate office, as an example, we'd have to remind people that if you're in an emergency in your office building, in many cases you have to dial 911. Which is really difficult for the brain to process when you're in a high stress, high concern, because you're, high stress, high concern. The average human brain can remember, recall, and process those 3 digits.
Right.
But then to have the awareness to say, I'm actually in an office environment, and this office requires me to dial the 9 before a 911. That was it was pretty challenging for some folks in that high stress, high concern environment.
Just adding that one additional number, for example, puts the and again, where typically and especially in a crisis, where the breaking point in terms of the brain, we're looking for shortcuts, and that was one of the contributions of Professor Kahneman that won him his Nobel Prize. Not just the 1n equal 3p or loss aversion theory, that the brain is continually looking for shortcuts as a way by which to process information about complex issues. Certainly, the complex issue that we deal with in our profession is crisis. And the question is, how does the brain shortcut its way to a crisis decision? It looks for information that is short and simple. So Aristotle offered up the rule of 3, but then he offered up one more, which I find one of the most interesting of all, the templates of risk communication, which is the ALE. So we have the rule of 3, we have the 2793, we have the 1n equals 3p, and now we have the content for the structural messages. For example, ALE, first offered by Aristotle over 2,000 years ago. And I'll give you a hint on this one, Ben. I'll give you the Greek. So I'm testing your Latin, I'm testing your Greek. Ethos, pathos, logos. So the 3 messages that form content for Aristotle, and you could argue this was the first message map, because you have a message explaining or developing the notion of pathos, ethos, and logos. What do those 3 words mean?
I'm digging back into
you could cheat on this. You can do a Google search while we're talking, and how would I know?
Well, it's like it's connected to like relatability and emotions. I'm trying to.
There, you're going in the right direction. That's right.
I'm trying to land there somewhere.
So here we go. It's authority, logic, and emotion.
Oh, okay. We talked about that when we were talking about the toilet paper hoarding.
That's right. So the first thing we look for is, what do the authorities have to say about the issue? An authority could be everything from the rules, the regulations, expert opinion on an issue, wise people, elders, etc. What do the authorities have to say about this issue? That's message number 1. Message number 2, if people do not accept the authority, what can logic lead us to. The Greeks claimed they invented logic, if the syllogism, if A, then B. And so the second message would be to take that syllogism, if A, then B, and apply it to the risk or crisis issue. If you want to be safe, you should, and then you have the three things that you would offer. And the third message, if that's not working, if you tried your authoritative message, wash your hands, stay home if you're sick, cover your cough or sneeze, whatever it might be. If that's not working, the logic is not working, if you do these things, you're more likely to protect yourself and your family. Then you have your third arrow in your quiver, which is called emotion. And Aristotle said, if these are your three arrows in your quiver, your risk and crisis communication quiver. You've got authority, logic, and emotions you can use in order to influence people, influence them in terms of trust, influence them in terms of their knowledge about an issue, and influence them about whether or not they want to have a positive relationship with you. Those are the three goals of risk and crisis communication. And if I present the information in such a way that I can relate to it, attention, recall, understanding, you're more likely to be successful. And that's ultimately what we want.
There you have it, the power of these three things by the man himself, Dr. Covello.
Loved it. Great. Lots of fun.